Hello, everyone. I got a comment on my last video from Losoyo. He was challenging the statistics that I pulled out of my ass, and those are my words, not his, in his comment. When I said that I was pulling these numbers out of my ass, these were the numbers that I remembered that I was taught while I was in University of Wisconsin in psychology courses, and the things that I saw as well. But I knew that I was pulling those numbers out of my ass because I was going off memory, and those were numbers that I was taught in 2004 to 2008 while I was in those courses. And, you know, the information presented in classes always lags behind the newest information. So I was probably going off of numbers that were probably as late as like the late 90s, early 2000s, you know? So I said I was pulling those numbers out of my ass, right? So the specific things I said was I was in classes where it was 80% female to 20% male, psychology classes, right? And also that the workforce that I was going to be going into was 60% male, 40% female, right? That's what I learned about the field that I was going into. Now, the numbers for the classes that I was taking were fresh when I was taking those classes. And it actually bears out with the outcomes that we're seeing today in the field of psychology. But the numbers that I gave for the workforce were not accurate as to the time I was taking those courses because the shift had already begun. Prior to me taking my undergrad degree, years before that, psychology was dominated by men. And in the 70s, it was unheard of for you to see female psychologists. So, like, from the 70s, it gradually got more and more women into the field. And then by the time I was in school for my undergrad degree, starting around 2004, it actually had gotten to the point where it was 40% men, 60% women. Okay? And a lot of them, the women were school psychologists that were working in elementary schools, that they actually were 75% of their field to 25% male. Now, since then, what's happened is a stark change from what we had in the 70s of a male-dominated field, where all fields were pretty much male-dominated back then, you know? It's like the old guard had to die out. All the professorships that had tenure, those professors just had to die out. And so gradually we see that women are more included, but in psychology there's this horrible... I say horrible. It could be amazing depending on your perspective. There's this pendulum shift of, since I was in school with an 80% female class, now in the workforce 10 years later, it's like 75% female across the board. But I'm only now looking this up because Losoyo challenged my statistics. He said, the statistics simply don't bear out what you're saying here. Also, my anecdotal evidence is completely different from yours. Even to this day, psychology professions are dominated by women. There has been a rise in men in the psychology profession, but that's only in the last 2 years. Additionally, my wife, whom has a master's in psychology, worked for a company that sent her to prisons of every stripe, even Rikers. So, unfortunately, I cannot say I agree with your analysis here. Anyways, the part where I believe he is wrong, based on what I've been looking at, is men being having an uptick in the last 2 years. I actually can't see the information on that. I can see that men are increasingly enrolling in psychology courses versus social work. And I think that might have something to do with a little trend in the world called social justice being played out in different arenas online where battle lines are being drawn, and so men are headed towards hard science and staying away from places that are infected with woo and places where respect for diversity is a primary paramount goal versus the hard science of what's going to get things done. So I can see where men would be headed towards psychology and counseling versus women going for their masters of social work and LCSWs. In fact, the majority of LCSWs that I know are female, and anecdotally still, if I think about where I'm working, the niche field that I'm working in, it's still mostly men, but only slightly. But upper management tends to have LCSW degrees rather than psychology, psychotherapy, and counseling. They tend to have LCSWs, and there is a lot of women on boards, on in upper management. So I do see that there's a majority of like upper management female domination. Let's see. I'm happy for your wife that she gets to go to all of those places and that she has been all those places. But the part where I think that my analysis was truer than what you're saying is when I was in school and when I got those numbers, it was 40% men. I said 60% men. It was still 40% men. And now it's far less, And what's happened to the field? What's happened to employment in the field since then? The number one most unemployed major is clinical psychology. And it happens to be dominated by women now. That 75% of the workforce is women, and also a majority of the people going to college for psychology are women. The average for people not working in the field that they went to school for is 45%, based on a poll by Career Builder. That's the most recent numbers I could come up with, right? 45%. But the numbers for psychology are only 25% of them are working in the same field. 45% if you get any other degree, you're going to be working in your field. 25% you are going to be working in your field if you got a psychology major. Now, why is that? I know this is going to seem like a very feminist-y, social justice-y thing to think, but maybe it's the fact that it's dominated by women now, and that in the real world, men have an advantage in getting hired. And so it could also be oversaturation of psychology in general, as far as universities just churning out people with degrees. But I tend to think that if psychology had more of a percentage male dominance as far as people going into school for it, I think that there would probably be an uptick in employability and people working in the field. And I feel like the union that social workers have that has created things like social workers, licensed clinical social workers, being the only ones who can bill Medicare for the elderly, versus there's no one who has a psychology degree that can get a license and then bill Medicare because it's like an exclusive right to social workers. I feel like that would have been overturned immediately by a union of men who in psychology, who were complaining that they couldn't bill for their services for the elderly. There really definitely is things to look at as far as when a field gets taken over by the gender that is not treated as fairly. What happens to employability? And what happens to the value of everyone's degree altogether when there isn't parity and an equal percentage of men and women in the field? What happens to women's degrees when their male counterparts dominate their field? I'm guessing the entire industry as a whole gets paid more because the men will demand it, and the men will get it. So yeah, I guess if there's any more discussion to be had on this, just leave me comments because I'll be looking at these numbers for a while. I keep on finding new little statistical anomalies about my field, and it's fascinating. Thank you, Losoyo, for leaving your comment because you made me delve a little bit deeper.